Good morning, everybody. As maybe you remember from the Monday, I am André Biancarelli, but I'm not here as the director. Carol invited me, Carol and the organizing committee invited me to present some contribution here. Those are my topics, also my research topics, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure. As I said on Monday, for me, this edition is special for obvious reasons, and I'm here to say the last lecture, maybe the worst, but thank you everybody for the persistence and everybody who is here. I suggested some time ago, last week maybe, to change the order. Originally, I would say the first one today, and Ricardo the second one. The reason is not about wake up later or something like that, but because of the, as he said, my entry here, my contribution will be more focused, but on the same big approach. We used to call it the currency hierarchy approach. I like this name. And my first point here will be try to make a map and localize my contribution today on that map. What I would say about is about the financial asymmetry, as I will say in 2 minutes, 1 minute. Let me control my time. The idea of asymmetries is very important to organize the ideas, and the financial one is my focus here, especially liquidity cycles. That is one of the features of this financial asymmetry. And then points 3 and 4 are my specific contributions. We are going to look at Brazilian situation, Brazilian external accounts, and some novelties, some new features of Brazilian external sector on the last 20 or something years. And the fourth one is some ideas, preliminary ideas, hypotheses that I'm working on last times, works in progress, but my intention here is just to invite some of you to collaborate, to discuss these ideas about a specific situation of Brazil, and I hope and I expect that my contribution will be complementary to the previous one. Well, let's see here, the currency hierarchy approach. I said that I like this name, the currency hierarchy, because of it stresses the most important of the asymmetries. Changing the order, Daniela Prats, following the suggestions of José Antonio Campo, organized some of the ideas. I guess this is a very useful organization. That's the International Monetary and Financial System, IMFS, is marked to countries like Brazil, to emerging markets or to peripheral countries, is marked by 3 asymmetries: monetary, macroeconomic, and financial one. But the monetary one is the most important, it's the mother of all asymmetries, because of the difference in quality of currencies, national currencies. Because of this, the currency hierarchy approach departs from this. But another way of name it, the approach I like to also, is the Keynesian and structuralist approach. Why this? Why those 2 adjectives? Keynesian, because it's not only heterodox, but influenced by the ideas of financialization, finance-led. The international monetary system is structurally marked by instability, speculation, short-termism, liquidity preference on the international level, and is a system crisis-prone. crisis, financial crisis, exchange rate crisis are not occasional. They are part of the system. This is the Keynesian part of monetary theory of production, etc., etc. But we have some Latin American structuralist origins also. ECLAC, for those, I guess everyone knows what it is, CEPAL origins. The idea, the founding idea of centric periphery. And from this, Predish and other and the followers from CEPAL. And the idea of asymmetries is very typical of this approach to a lot of things. Also, the financial and monetary aspects of international economy. And this approach, I put some names here. It's a problem to forget someone, but those are people here in Unicamp and some international connections. But we should improve and increase this interaction. Well, in terms of meanings, our idea departs from this side. Here it's an organization. It's more. I guess it's more easy to visualize. International monetary and financial system there's a general, and Ricardo said a lot about this, stability, speculation, crisis, etc. And regarding our countries, I guess everybody here is from peripheral or developing countries. This is a problem, but the other side, to us, is specific and very difficult feature of international monetary financial system that is marked by asymmetries. The first one is monetary, has to do with a lot of things that Ricardo just teach us about the difference in quality of currencies, etc. Macroeconomic asymmetry has to do with policy space. Ricardo said something about this. The constraints to make monetary, exchange rate, and fiscal policies. So my point here is to focus on the financial aspect of international asymmetries. And a way of talk about this is to say that there are quantitative and qualitative dimensions of the financial asymmetry of international relations. All of this is based on Daniela's contribution a long time ago. There are a lot of aspects about this, but in terms of quantitative quantities, one aspect, what makes the international and monetary financial system asymmetrical to us is that countries like Brazil, but not only Brazil, developing countries in general, are a small or marginal share of global portfolios. What is the problem with that? That in periods of turbulence, of risk aversion, they are the assets denominated on that countries or assets in those markets are the first candidates to liquidation in times of turbulence, times of elevation of risk aversion. So we are a small part of a big. To us, it's important the share of this capital movement for us, but to the global, a small part. And the second part of the reasoning is qualitative aspects, and that part, that right direction here, will be my focus. Just some notes, very short notes. That aspect of relative size is the basic idea is that financial globalization, etc., is an integration of unequal partners. And this is not a heterodox or South American or developing world concept just. Is also present in mainstream research a long time ago. Those concepts and contributions of very well considered economists in mainstream academics or other circles. For example, the idea from Oxfeld and Taylor on that book that the financial globalization is basically a rich affair. The participation of poor countries is the rest. And previously, Robert Lucas' speech, I guess, is on the Nobel Prize award. He said this speech about the paradox. Why doesn't capital flow from rich to poor countries? It was a paradox. It's a sign that even in the more conventional wisdom, this unequal division of capital flows, contrary to the conventional wisdom, is a specialized fact. Nobody can deny that the globalization is not a distribution of capital allocation through the opening of financial markets, etc. Here, just I won't spend too much time on this, but just a graphic illustration. It's an old BIS report here, just to say that the most important part of international cross-border flows is among Europe, US, and Asia, more Japan, and increasingly China, but our participation here is marginal. So this is a basic point, a departing point. The second one, the idea of drivers of capital flows. This is an old discussion also. What drives the movements and the different phases of availability of capital, of external finance to countries like Brazil or Latin America or something like that? This also is a old and debated question in mainstream circles. For example, this, for us, it was very important, discussion about Latin America re-entry on the international financial markets at the beginning of the 90s, after the 80s debt crisis. There was a discussion. The names are very known. Mohamed Al-Erian, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, they said in 92, 93 that the most important factors for this re-entry were pull factors, external factors. No, domestic factors, attraction factors. But other economists like Guillermo Calvo said on that time that the push factors, the exchange interest rates and growth rates in central countries were the most important explanations for this movement of capital that was a change. So this is an old discussion, but just to put this pull versus push factors debate about the drivers of capital flows. More recently, after 2008 great financial crisis, this is like a resolved discussion. All the literature points to this. The push factors are more important. When capital flows are related to countries, developing or peripheral countries, the push factors certainly is more important. Namely, VIX, that is a proxy of risk aversion on international dimension, and interest rate differentials are the most relevant factors to explain different phases of financial external finance availability to countries like Brazil. In our heterodox Campinas or something currency hierarchy, Keynesian structuralist, the name is not more important. To us, external factors are always more important, even because of the small share of marginal global portfolios. This perspective has obvious implications in terms of policy. If you don't control the availability, you have to be more cautious. Capital controls, regulatory issues, etc., etc. But also, and running to my point, this external determination of capital flows has to do with the specific point that is international liquidity cycles. The idea, also an obvious idea, it's not an idea, it's a code stuff. It's a fact, crystallized fact, statistical evidence that a long time, this aspect of international relations, availability of external financing to countries like Brazil is not the same a long time. It's not constant, contrary to the conventionalism also. And this, again, sorry for the repetition, again, this is not an exclusively heterodox or peripheral analysis. Since the 90s, the conventional literature also pay attention to this feature, to this phenomenon, and very, very nice, very interesting concepts in terms of statistical descriptions. The idea of capital flow surges, the idea of episodes, distinction of episode surges. The idea, it's, if I'm not, my memory is not hurting me now, the idea of sudden stop is from Guillermo Calvo in 90-something. It's an old idea that suddenly this availability disappeared. Sudden stops in capital flows, waves, bonanzas, etc. But most of this literature is more descriptive than analytical. It's a lack of a more broad explanation. Why it is? What are the reasons for this oscillation, this alternance, this between good and bad phases in that for us is very, very important. Now, Eleni Ray works, we are talking about her some time ago. That part of her work, to me, is very important. It's an evolution in terms of explanation, because she said, well, besides the idea of there's not a trilemma, just a dilemma, besides the defense of capital controls, but the idea, it's an empirical constatation, that there is a global financial cycle. I will say something more about this idea on the last slide, but the basic idea is that not just capital flows around the world, but a lot of other risk assets like commodity prices, land prices, exchange rates are all moving more or less together. It's a co-movement of a lot of risk assets, and the main determinant, it's an empirical evaluation, the main factor is risk aversion and Fed funds rate. So she can, inside the mainstream, put the idea of a global financial cycle that is in description terms very close to our idea of liquidity cycle. And she said also that domestic credit is influenced by international liquidity. In a tentative note, it's my PhD thesis, those parts, right? Some time ago. We define the international liquidity cycle with a Minskian approach. What drives the movement? The search for yield in assets denominated in weaker currencies is always, what is the movement? Is always a reduction in risk aversion from global investors. Or, if you don't want to use risk aversion, more Keynesian, Minskian time, a reduction in liquidity preference on the international level. Well, these cycles were marked by an optimistic period when the expectations about future earnings support the growing financial operation in risky regions, increasing the financial fragility, followed by some event that shifts the general state of expectations about the combination of risk return in emerging markets vis-a-vis those in central economies, and then it starts sometimes suddenly, more commonly suddenly, sometimes gradually, the movement back to quality, flight to quality, back to home. This is a consequence of the idea of pyramids, etc. So, this is the basic reasoning about liquidity cycle derived from financial asymmetry, derived from the Keynesian structuralist approach. Here's some evidence about international liquidity cycles. A very long evidence from the 70s, three big waves, but it's 12 years ago. It's not so easy to find evidence. Quantitative aspects of measuring of international liquidity cycle is another chapter. I won't bother you with that part, but trust me, there are complementary ways to look at this aspect. Here it's private capital flows. If I'm not wrong, those numbers came from World Bank, but there are net flows. Here is gross flows. It's just sorry for the Portuguese title and source. This is a calculation from data from Institute of International Finance. That is very difficult to get data from there. But here it's a long 78 evidence showing the alternance of good and bad phases. Here, our last decade, debt crisis, especially Latin America. Here is the re-entry of Latin America, and here 25 emerging markets. Re-entry on the international financial markets. Here the period of East Asian crisis, Russian crisis, Brazilian crisis, and here is the new century wave or cycle. Here is the international financial crisis, etc. This is from the Renato Rosa's PhD thesis. Another way of measuring is here is flows in terms of dollars and GDP shares. Here is an index number 2006 equals 100, and here the oscillations. The numbers here came 4 years ago. Let me see here. Those are. Wow. Sorry. I don't see it. Here are the numbers from the last month. What we can say, I'm not worried here to make a periodization or a specific division of the first cycle, the second one. In other words, we do this, but the news are that since 2 or 3 years ago, times are more turbulent. The COVID shock in 2020 represents here the most important sudden stop in history, the most impressive. But the sudden return was also very impressive. So turbulent times. If we get this graph, we show that this is important for what we will say in some minutes. In this 21st century, we had a very big wave, very important high tide phase of liquidity cycle until obviously the international financial crisis in 2008. After this, a return of the liquidity, and then since 2014, a decrease, important decrease. Here we have a more important break or a low tide here. Here it was more short. If we look at this, see here, these numbers were more or less the same. But since 2020, the times are in trouble. The numbers are not comparable, but the movement is the same because of COVID, the Ukraine war, and later weeks, these movements of interest rate increases in central economies. Probably we are in the middle of a low tide phase of a liquidity cycle. Well, just to put these ideas on the table, just to say, think of a country like Brazil or like Argentina that we talk a lot, and other people. Our perspective to say, let's think about economic development possibilities and conditions. In our perspective, we have to look at this firstly. What is the landscape, global financial landscape that can improve or difficult the possibilities of development? So the old debate of external and domestic factors influencing domestic development. So this is the landscape. What are the ideas about, I will put not on the slide of quantity, but this figure to say, this is a very long depiction of Brazilian absorption of capital inflows. Sorry again for the Portuguese title of the graphs, but here is just the non-resident flows to Brazilian economy registered on the balance of payments of Brazil, and adapted to the methodological changes in the balance of payments manual 5 or 6, etc. But this is a long time series showing clearly, in Brazilian case, four phases, 4 waves of massive capital inflows absorption. The first one here is also as a share of GDP. The fourth one is 56-62 in Brazilian history. This is the part, the heavy industrialization of Brazil. Plano de metas. It was a huge absorption of FDI and other forms. Here is the long period of external indebtedness in 70s that finished with the difficult period of debt crisis during the 80s. Here is the re-entry of Brazil, financial opening, neoliberal reforms of the 90s, more short period of scarcity or lack of financial support, external financial support. And here is the more recent period from 2005 till 14. This bad phase started in Brazil. Pay attention. Remember that idea. It started more clearly in 2014, the middle. But in annual data, they are more marked in 2015. Here is the numbers are not the same numbers, but this is the same picture in terms of time, but showing in red the financial and capital account. Here is net, not this is gross data, just capital inflows, non-residents. Here are the numbers in terms of residents plus non-residents, and show the same 4 phases corresponding to important phases of current account deficits and reversals in blue. And the red, the green bars are the variation in international reserves. How can we, looking to a long picture like that, to say that we are in trouble? Balance of payment crisis or exchange rate crisis. What is the most clearly sign of crisis is the green one, loss of reserves. Look at here, through this lens, here 82 was the worst year. Makes sense. 82 is the worst year in Brazilian external accounts history. 2002 was the second one, worst. Because of this, we can discuss it. I guess now, in that aspect, we are much better than 20 years ago. But this is part of what I will say. But here we have a picture of a kind of, with different sizes, in terms of economic growth, productive structure, the effects of these periods are quite different along history. I don't like, but this is another discussion, I don't like the idea that always when you have current account deficit, you appreciate your currency, you make a deindustrialization process, and you go to have a exchange rate crisis. No, here the opposite. And here is deindustrialization, and here also. But the relations between capital inflows, entry, and productive structure and economic growth are not similar, at least in Brazil. So this is another part of the discussion. But looking just to the external accounts, it seems to be a very common history. A period of external inflows, clearly influenced by the international domestic and international liquidity cycle. A country like Brazil is like captured on this movement, a huge current account deficit that came to an end, came to a crisis. It's a, how can I say? It's a story, a repetitive story. But, and this is my point, let's go back to the description. The story is almost always the same. Large financial inflows, current account deficits, cycle, international liquidity cycle reversion, balance of payment crisis, adjustment, painful adjustment, recession, IMF support with conditionalities, current account reversal, exchange rate devaluation, and a long or short period of dollar scarcity. And when countries have to deal with themselves without the possibility of current account deficits. But, and here is my point, the novelty is that the last phase seems to be a little bit different, especially at the end. Why? There was absolutely no balance of payment crisis. The international liquidity cycles reverted clearly in 2014-15. Brazil entered in that period. The time coincidence is clear, but the causality is, to me, is not clear. There was no balance of payment crisis at the end, no reserve loss, nothing about IMF. There was a very important economist that said in 2015, I guess we should go to the IMF just to control our policy, etc. Just the bad part of the IMF, not the good one, because we didn't need it. Later we can discuss about it. But no need of IMF in 2014 or 15. We had, in 2015, a break, complete reversal of political economic policy. But the point is not, the cause, the motivation was not external. This is the novelty. The most important recession in Brazilian history and the very slow recovery on the following years was not caused by a balance of payment constraint. All of the important crises here, one, the beginning of 60s, here, the most important one, the long and deepest, during the 80s, and here, in the last years of 90s, the beginning of the century, were periods of difficult IMF during the 60s, no, but there was a problem of growth, development, etc. So something is different now. Great. Only in 2009 and 2020, because the combination of Mr. Paulo Guedes' declaration and politics about our reserves and the COVID shock that was a very important, we lost some reserves. But far from balance of payment crisis. We're not. Brazilian economy in last 7 years, we suffered a lot of problems, fiscal problems, growth problems, social problems, but the novelty is that in terms of balance of payments, we are in a good position, still today. So this is the interesting point that in latest years, with a lot of difficulties, we are trying to think about. Why? This time was different, but why? Here, the hypotheses are related to two aspects that has to do with stocks, not only flows. The first one is more obvious. Ricardo said something about this, that for a country with a weaker currency like Brazil, a way of live in that very dangerous world is to make a backed currency, to increase, to accumulate international reserves, where it has a lot of costs and problems, etc. In general terms, in abstract terms, this is not a rationality, but this is the way to live in the financial globalization. That left panel is the amount of international reserves of Brazil. It increased a lot between 2006 and 2012. And here is the loss of reserves, Mr. Guedes' work. But we are obviously more protected by accumulating external assets, especially in the form of reserves. But this is part of the explanation to our perspective. Because on the size of the liabilities increased a lot, much more than assets. The net international position of Brazil decreased. We are more indebted. We are our total external liabilities more than double the assets. It's, well, size of the GDP, Ricardo said to me, the last numbers. But there is an important change in the composition of external liabilities in Brazil. What is the change? An important part of that was changed the currency denomination. Usually, a country like Brazil, a long history, gets international debts or other forms of liabilities in dollars or international currencies. What is the problem? It's the famous peso problem. In the literature, this point has the name of peso problem, not just related to Argentina, but also a lot of pesos in Latin America. Because when you have a liability in a country that you don't control, when there is a devaluation, the stock of the debt increased a lot. But what happened to Brazil is not to all developing or emerging countries that happened this. But Brazil is a case of de-dollarization of external liabilities. This is the right panel in terms of shares. In 2002, 75% of Brazilian external liabilities were in dollars and just 25, just a quarter, were in domestic currencies. This picture changed, inverted, and here, during the huge devaluation of 2015, it approximates, and then open there. I the numbers from 2002 to here are more close, but I didn't find the graph. Sorry. It's not just too much updated, but this is our last years. We are working with some students, especially Renato Rosa. We are working on that important change in Brazilian external sector. We are protected from the appraisal problem. When there is a huge devaluation of our country, the costs go to the creditors, to the external. It's the opposite of 80s, the opposite of 90s, but when, for example, 2008, the last quarter of 2008, for example, 2015, who suffered the losses from exchange rate devaluation? It's not Brazilians. No. It's a burden to the creditors. But why this happened? It was a policy planned. It's a strategic decision of Brazil? No, probably no. It was a product of long time, especially that period to here, domestic currency overvaluation, appreciation of Brazilian currency to an international investor in Brazil was better to be in reais than in dollars, because here the dollar was 4 reais and here it was 1.5. So this was not, it's a byproduct of our currency over appreciation. And this is, in terms of practice channels, this was mainly by the entry of foreign investors in domestic markets of bonds and stocks. In terms of Brazil, private and public bonds. The point that Ricardo was saying about Argentina's lack of domestic debt in domestic currency. In Brazil, the share of public debt that were bought by the international increased a lot, international investors. But this is the point that we presented as one of most important novelties of this time, and this is discussed also in the international literature. It's not just Brazil, but it's not a common fashion of all international developing or emerging countries. So, coming to an end, I won't say too much. What are the implications of these new features? If we just look at the balance of payments, someone more optimistic could say that we are living in a model of balance of payments unconstrained growth, or growth without dollar restrictions, dollar shortage. Maybe end of external vulnerability. We have now protected and we can make everything we want. It's a possible view. I guess it's too much optimistic. Sometimes, by my colleagues here, someone call me too much optimistic. But depends on the relative position you are. Some assessments, like Daniela, Luis Fernando, Barbara Fritz, Anina, and Juan Pablo, even the great Yuma Sakius, look at this situation and said, no, the situation is worse. The vulnerability increases when an international investor is holding your public debt. The influence is higher and you are in a worse position than before. Other people said, no, if we have reserves, we have the power to issue our money and make all the debt we want, etc. I'm in the intermediate position. To me, the situation is clearly much better than before. This new feature of a relative protection against exchange rate shocks, or the new position of Brazilian balance of payments is better. Remembering a famous quote in Brazilian economic history, that's Simonsen, that said, to Brazil and Latin America, inflation hurts, but balance of payments kills. And in that aspect, it's very useful to look to Argentina. Compare the situation between a country who has reserves and public debt and liabilities in domestic currency with, I don't think Brazilian situation, economic situation is good, not at all. But related to monetary and financial aspects, it's good to have our money. And Argentina is suffering this. So this is the practical effect. But I'm not on that completely optimistic position that everything is solved. We have autonomy, completely autonomy in terms of monetary and political and fiscal policy. No. I guess this position certainly doesn't mean the absence of external influence. Brazil is not an independent and autonomous economy, unfortunately. No. And here we have a large room for theoretical and practical and empirical discussions, but I put on red because it's in terms of theoretical reflections. We're back into the structuralist tradition. The core concept to me is the central periphery. And these relations between the center and periphery are changing a long time. And the idea is that these different positions in the international economy is the permanent situation. But the other aspect that were emphasized along CEPAL and here, even Campinas school concepts like decline in terms of trade, balance of payment constraints, strictly constraints of balance of payments to growth, maybe they are not present. But external influence to Brazilian or to an peripheral economy are still present, but they are new. New and, my contribution, indirect channels of influence from external financial situation, namely international liquidity cycle, influences or sometimes pushes the economy, Brazilian economy, to up and down without direct effect on balance of payments accounts. This is the idea of indirect channels of influence. Recently, some research are identifying three major channels. The first one is not my business. It's Bruno, Ricardo, Pedro Rossi, and all of people who are discussing the influence and the restrictions or the constraints to macroeconomic policies and variables. For example, you can have an exchange rate determination completely controlled by the international liquidity cycle without impact of this in the balance of payments account. There is a very specific and difficult to understand situation of Brazilian exchange rate market that you can see. This is the hypothesis. Our exchange rate is controlled by external factors interacting with domestic interest rates. But this doesn't appear on the balance of payments. If you go to the balance of payments to see, no relation. And obviously, monetary policy, Ricardo said a lot about this, constraints to the determination of domestic interest rates, and even fiscal policy, that is a more complicated situation. But in my opinion, we have to have this in mind when think about possibilities of increase of fiscal spending or increasing the size of domestic debt. The second indirect channel it's not my field of research, but I'm I don't know if I should, but I'm trying to investigate some relations of domestic production and industrial and production investment subordinated to something like a global productive cycle. Given the Brazilian industrial production is completely internationalized, much more than decades ago, the decisions of level of production investment are much more influenced by multinational companies, global value chains, than domestic circumstances and policies. And the last channel, influence on domestic credit, even without external financing for this operation of credit. Domestic credit is highly influenced by the international liquidity cycle, even without domestic banks getting money in the international market to make domestic credit. There are some correlations, and we are discussing it. So, one last question that has to do with that perspective of a different position of the financial relations of Brazil to the international economy is given by this picture. What is this? In red is the CRB commodity index price, and in black, the Brazilian GDP behavior. I'm not so good in econometrics, but you don't have to be good in econometrics to see that something is related here. 75% correlation. This is quarterly data from 2005 to 3 years ago. But the updated version of this graph is much more linked. Well, look at this picture. Brazil is a commodity-driven economy. We are back to 40s. The question is, despite all the industrialization process on the last century, the second half of 20th century in Brazil, we depart from a very primary export structure to a urban, diversified, industrialized, and services economy. But when you look today, this picture for Bolivia, I don't know if there is anyone from Bolivia here. No. Maybe the correlation between commodity prices and Bolivian GDP is more or less like this. In terms of trade, well, those are the initial questions of structuralist Latin American tradition. What is happening? We're back to the farmer. We're back to the beginning of the last century. Some people believe it. The deindustrialization policy no trend, it was not a policy, a non-policy. But Brazil, here, in words, despite all the complexity, commodity prices are the main drivers of Brazilian growth. Directly, deindustrialization trends in Brazil since 30 years ago, Brazil is back to primary export path. The question is this. It's a question, it's an invitation to think about. My opinion, my first opinion, my hypothesis is that no. The answer is no. Brazilian, despite the much lower participation of industry in GDP, it's a much more complex economy than our neighbors, some of our neighbors. And maybe the original source of impulse is not the commodity markets itself, but the global financial cycle. The idea is that this co-movement of risky assets around the world influence the capital flows availability, but also the commodity markets. And by indirect channels, maybe is a direct or an influence to Brazilian growth. So the channel, the connection is not just with commodities, it's with the financial conditions around it. So very initial hypothesis here, and this is my finish, is an invitation to discuss and to collaborate, that the idea is that Brazilian economy maybe is not just a finance-led economy, but an international finance-led economy. Even with a beautiful balance of payments, we are subject to a strong influence of international financial, specifically financial conditions. Well, is this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, André, for this very, very interesting presentation. Before I start with the questions, Professor Ricardo wants to make a short comment.
Short comment, very brief one, to try to link your lecture. I like very much a title on an article by you, and I think it's an article that is called The Old Ladies in New Clothes. Because I think it's this. We don't have this traditional balance of payments, phrases, never more.
I don't know if it's never.
Yeah, now more, probably never more. Why? Because we backed our currency. Brazil has more or less 20% of GDP in dollars reserves. This is a huge amount. And this is very important to change the way we are inserted in the international environment, in cycles, and so on. But why I insist on this idea that it's no new clothes to the old way? First of all, because we are more sensitive to international prices. In what sense? Interest rates, exchange rates. Prices that we do not control. This is very important. This is the first, and it comes from the level of interest rate, the liquidity, but as a wealth effect as well. This is very important. Why? Because we have 100% of GDP in liabilities, international liabilities, and 60% in assets. So there is a huge effect, wealth effects in this economy, in the movement of the price, macroeconomic price, that we do not control. This is the first. Of course, we don't have this kind of prices anymore. The second question is to think. For you, it's a free
thinking.
Free thinking. Yeah. Is that maybe you have transformed your balance of payment, prices of constraint, maybe to say constraint is better, in a fiscal constraint. Better? Of course, it's better. Because yeah, it's better. It's not it's not a problem. It's a problem. But it's better. Less worse than that. In what
Second
sense?
best, Ricardo.
Yeah, second worst. In what sense we can say this? Because your backend currency has a cost. Sometimes it's very huge cost. Think the last few months, we are paying 2% of GDP. This is the cost of carrying the reserve. Second, this movement, you are correct. You have a lot of investment in securities in the Brazilian market, but you have to deal with this, and you have to deal through swaps. Because it's the way that the market operates. You don't have to sell reserve, but you sell swaps, buy swaps. And hedge. You have to have hedges, speculation, to curb speculation. So you have another cost in this. And this is a fiscal cost. Better to have a fiscal cost than external. No, I can agree with this. But the problem is there. This is the question that I think different in another level that is not the level of less developed country. It's true. but it's a problem, continue to be a problem. And the old problem, in the sense that you do not control liquidity cycle, do not control the relevant international prices. This is to link with my.
Thank you very much. Ricardo mentioned a chapter I wrote with those ideas, but unfortunately just in Portuguese. That is called The Old Lady in New Clothes. It's a joke with the theatre piece that is the return of the old lady. The old lady is the external vulnerability, but she's back now. To Argentina, the same one, but to Brazil is a little bit different, but she's here again. So you want?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation, especially for using the eclectic framework and to think about Latin America, even if your lecture was about Brazil. My group chose this topic for our presentation. So thinking about the research agenda in that framework, in this framework, right? You talk about the industrialization. That is the Brazilian case and the Mexican case in some way. But what about those who never developed an endogenous industry as the Paraguayan case? Because the only industry we're actually having is the Brazilian maquila that at the same time are the worst part of the value chain. So how can we think about it?
Well, very difficult. Very good question. Thank you. Your name, please. If
Larissa.
someone will ask a question, please say the name and the origin.
Okay.
Larissa.
Larissa. Yes.
No. I will answer. Well, Larissa, maybe the most complete answer to this question had to do with the first edition of International School that had to do with productive structure, industrial policies, etc. Trying to escape from your question, I guess the dimension of the regional integration that you mentioned before, in terms of productive complementarity, maybe we can think about this, because if I understood correctly, you were saying, you're talking about deindustrialization, but what about countries that have never had an industry? I don't know. Questions of size. Certainly, the way, it's not my business, not my field of research, but certainly the way is not to put the Brazilian shoes industry in Paraguay. Just to explore the wealth and the minimum wage labor force. But maybe efforts on productive complementarity through regional integration and things like that. But I don't know. Sometimes I see you said about using the eclectics and think as Brazil like part of this region. A lot of Brazilian economists say, "Oh, Latin America, they are strange. We are part of it, but we are very different." That graph shows that these important relations were not so different, but certainly different economic space has different roles to play in a complementary productive strategy. I don't know that if it's possible to think of an industrialization effort in a country, a small country. I don't know if in Brazil we have space in the international production situation today. If we have a complete reindustrialization strategy, maybe we have to choose sectors, strategic, but I don't know. Maybe the regional integration, productive integration, is a possible way. Sorry.
Then Renan, and then Thiago, and then Diego Maradona.
Diego Maradona? ¿Dónde está Diego?
So
Hello.
my question is a little bit general because I just want to hear talk about some topics. But in my group of discussion are talking about the possibilities of transparency, the subdevelopment situation of the periphery, and we have the topic related to some MMIT ideas like the possibility to maintain deficits and define our interest rates. So we thought in that sense something like, okay, so we can maintain some deficits, or okay, we can define our interest rates, and we have reserves, but we have strong, and you to show us external constraints. So in that case, my question is, and in that sense, you show us. I thought the reserves, it's more for protecting us and not to do some politics, do some things. I know the reindustrialization policy is not that simple, but I want to hear you about that, how to think in that possibility to our capability, our state capability to finance, to funding, and this Bob situation, this big Bob situation. So I want to hear you something like, okay, so we can do something about that, it's just to protect us and wait to a better liquidity cycle, something like that. So I just want to hear that.
Great, thank you. Directly or collect? Well, let me just answer. Hannah, without entering on the controversial about the possibilities of functional finance or MMT ideas in Brazil or in country. This, I guess, I like the idea of protective, like a shield. I like this idea. The reserves are a shield, kind of something that can absorb part of the fluctuations of international financial conditions to Brazilian economy. I guess another one that we used to have, today is too slow, is development banks. Think about the investment finance in a country like Brazil. Submitted a long history to a terrible macroeconomic instability. How can you think about long-term financing given our record of exchange rate, interest rate, inflation rate, instability? You have to have a body of, I'm entering on Ana Rosa's topic about development banks, etc. But I guess, for example, Brazilian BNDES is another piece of, another kind of shield, another piece of protection, because without this, when the investment finance needs would be attended by international debt. So we can, we would be back to the direct influence of liquidity cycles in Brazilian economy. It's like, sorry, but it's like Argentina. It's a period of exclusion, complete exclusion from international financial markets, followed by a very, very happy integration again that suddenly, fastly ends with an exchange rate crisis. But why? Part of this is short-term speculation, but part of this is financial needs of long-term investment. So I would say that, to answer your question, certainly, besides some parts of Ricardo knows a lot about this, he made a proposal of using part of reserves to act as a...
The best.
The best, 4 years ago. the previous round of proposals. But maybe you can use part of the reserves to reduce exchange rate risks of long-term investments, etc. But first, international reserves are protection. It's a price you pay to live in a world like this. It's a high price, but it's important. And second, to think about investment, reindustrialization, etc., I guess even because of this better external situation, that we still have the tools to finance our needs in domestic currency. And to me, this makes a lot of difference. Even if I'm not so optimistic about the increase the domestic debt, definitely we have no limits. You won't bankrupt in your currency, etc., etc. I have those statements have to be got with careful in a country like ours. So this is my piece on that. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you for the presentation. It was great. I have a very direct question that I wanted to develop a little bit on what are the main economic policies or macroeconomic policies in international finance like. I remember the last word that you said we live like Brazil is international finance led economy. So what this means in terms of the policy? I mean, what is the main macroeconomic policy that can be done or even develop strategies in this scenario?
Well, one possibility, thank you very much for your question. One possibility is sit and wait a better situation of international economy. We have to count on the luck. Yeah, no, this is a joke. Well, I guess, despite some people on the last times say that I'm an optimistic about external situation of Brazil, in terms of development, this view is more pessimistic. Because if you think on the other way around, you look, you have current account deficit. You are about to have an exchange rate crisis that would put the exchange rates up, and this will solve your industrial competitiveness problems, etc., etc. No. The last 2 or 3 years in Brazil are a sign of this. It's not just the exchange rate that would solve structural problems of Brazil. But if you think in terms of another way of saying the same thing, is that the blockades, the difficulties to make an autonomous development policies submitted to that condition are more difficult, are more difficult to face, to fight against, because it has to do with the complete internationalization of Brazilian economy in terms of financial. It's not related to flows, it's to stocks. The public debt, the wealth. I understand something. Wealth, Brazilian wealth is denominated, is linked to the liquidity cycle. And in terms of industrial structure, much more. But I guess you have to try to protective measures on the short term. Certainly regulation of financial flows, or regulation of financial markets in general. Much more careful behavior on the exchange rate policy, etc., to try to gain some space. My view, repeatedly, my view is not the complete autonomous position, nor the completely submitted position. We are still in the intermediate position with some policy space, much more than in the past. Much more, in my point, in some aspects. But the long-time tasks, I guess, were more serious. Sorry for not being so optimistic, but you have
Sorry that I am asking again, but I'm really.
Sorry, but I don't. Sorry? Ignacio. Thank you. Are you from Argentina? From where?
From Córdoba.
Cordoba.
I will try to be really short. I agree with this idea of the global financial cycle like the main driver of the external flows. I did a work about Argentina, not so complete like this, but and I think that is similar the dynamic. But I also saw that that these effects are like exacerbated in periods that in Argentina has like had more financial liberalization, for example, the 19th and between 2015 and 2019. Was like the effects of the global financial cycle was like larger. So my question is, in this idea of like the reserve accumulation and the de-dollarization of public debt, like shields, to what extent do you think that capital controls and regulation in the external accounts could also be like a shield to avoid balance of payment crises and that kind of things?
Well, I guess this is the way. We have steps, even small or gradual steps on that direction are always recommended. But the beginning of your talk, you were talking about, if I'm wrong, you correct me, but you were talking about external or domestic influences on the capital flows. There is
on the the main importance of external, not like
yes, domestic. Some domestic factors are always important. Also, obviously, it's always an interaction between push and pull factors. But I remember now that there is a more detailed discussion that divides the domestic, especially the domestic factors, in short-term or conjunctural terms like growth, confidence, or interest rate, the most important, and structural, like financial opening. Certainly, a more integrated domestic financial market with the international ones are a domestic factor very important. You have to maybe enjoying, taking the opportunity of good times to try to put some sand on the wheels on that functioning mechanism to linking cycle with the domestic situation and capital, but not only capital controls. In Brazilian situation, it's important, but far from enough. You have to control exchange rate derivative futures markets and other banks' position in a lot of markets, but these ideas are not on the table today. But things change domestically and internationally. Maybe the opportunity will appear.
Any other questions? There are something blank.
So your name is
Thiago.
Ja.
Regarding the what concern, so we are in this international financial growth and you're proposing, which I agree, proposing. So we could accumulate reserves even in the periods of trade deficit, right? Because of this international inflow. And I actually was going to ask you for to. Can you go back to the graph of trade deficit? Yes. So here, we only could accumulate the reserves because of this capital, right? Because we're having deficit. So if we actually do this policy of capital controls and financial regulation, this would be harder to do, right? Because the aim was going to be reduce this So in the end, in a more controlled financial financial system and environment, the bond constraint would appear again.
We would be back to the old times. I know, I got what you would do. That Brazil chose a policy on that period that, in spite of controlling, in spite of reduce the links between domestic and financial and external markets, use the opportunity, firstly here, it's not appearing here, to pay the debt. Because since 2003, the situation is very good, very, very good. Brazil paid the debt, not public just, but private also. And later, accumulated reserves here. If you say here, the reserve accumulation, we worked with Ricardo, Bruno, and the colleagues in the Centro de Conjuntura here. They start to say, oh, it's time to accumulate reserve. Oh, since this part here. Yeah? 2 years later, Brazil became, but 2005-06. Firstly, it was very good to our structural position, external position, but without changing anything in terms of regulation. It was an option. I don't know if it's conscious or not, but it was an option. Could the combination, the policy mix could have been other. But certainly, this better, it's a paradox, this better position, these new features, this new closeness has to do with a very, how can I say, well-behaved policy in structural terms, in regulatory terms, etc. If you look here, when Brazil started to impose capital controls, reduce domestic interest rates, the flows started to decrease. Here, 2011, this is a paradox. But from now on, I don't know. But in the beginning, I guess back into the assumptions, basic assumptions. The most important determinant is the international cycle. If you take a good phase when it's not depending on the influence of domestic factors is lower, you could have accumulated reserves, regulate capital flows, and no problem of balance of payments. Because things depends much more external factors than on domestic ones.
Okay, so
Thank
thank you
you.
very much, and then we come back in the afternoon.
Thank you.